It is an expression that I often hear in the teacher's lounge after a student has expressed that they identify somewhere in the LGBTQ IAP+ spectrum. They are too young to make that decision, or it's just a phase. It is a sideways glance of the teacher across the hall as a 7th grade girl excitedly talks about her new girlfriend. It's the snide comments and jokes about the two boys who just won't stop touching each other in science class. It is the principal continually misgendering a recently transitioned parent during a grade level meeting. These dismissals and sideways glances may seem harmless, especially in the presence of other concerned adults and safely out of the earshot of the 12-year-old they are about, or behind the closed door of a boardroom when the school is clear of pupils. I would imagine if asked, the offenders would say these weren't meant to be hateful or harmful in any way. Or maybe they wouldn't. But the reality is that no matter what they are, these incidents are just one type of reactionary manifestation of an experience that contradicts the regulatory norms, expectations, biases, and homophobia that extends its arms into the public schools. Sadly, even in 2020, as society has begun moving towards increased acceptance and visibility for LGBTQ IAP+ youth and adults, it is still abundantly clear that teachers and administrators in K-12 schools construct, regulate, and censor authentic expression of gender and sexuality in schools through policies, practices, and purposeful curriculum grounded in homophobia and a perceived desire to preserve innocence in their students. So far in this semester, the course readings have opened my eyes to the hidden homophobia that lurks within the school and even in my own classroom. The perspectives of LGBTQ IAP+ youth and educators, as well as the scholars who have devoted their time to studying and writing about these issues in education, have begun to weave a narrative in my mind about the way that schools, teachers, and admin work together to construct an acceptable expression of gender and sexuality for their students and even their teachers, and the way that this works to silence and regulate all students, but most prominently LGBTQ IAP+ students. As Harper Benjamin Keenan wrote in Unscripting Curriculum Toward a Critical Trans Pedagogy, schools were not designed to support queer and trans people who defy imposed identity categorization. Schools were designed to sort people by gender through record-keeping facilities like bathrooms and activities like sports. This is not a problem unique to schools. It is a reflection of a society that was not designed to support queer and trans people. Page 554. This is the heart of it all. The way schools are constructed is firmly grounded in a heteronormative and binary experience, where students are subjected to an experience that attempts to consistently reaffirm a worldview that erases experiences and identities that are not straight, male, or straight female. Harper Benjamin Keenan recounts their experience preparing for a concert in school and dressing and doing their hair in a way that validated their identity and made them feel cool and handsome, but was perceived by the teacher as ridiculous because it was against what the teacher believed a girl should look like. The teacher actually went so far as to grab Keenan and rearrange their hair, which may seem extreme and an outlier, but in reality, teachers unknowingly rearrange the identities of their students on a daily basis without even realizing it. I think about the way that teachers address their classes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, separating physical education classes based on perceived gender, hall passes labeled girls and boys bathroom passes, calling on students or addressing students as Mr. or Miss and whatever their last name is. These are just a few of the ways I identified while sitting here that construct and reinforce a binary for students that forces them to choose and shows them that the only valid options are the ones that we are allowing them to take. While many teachers, including myself, have begun to try and find ways to cast off the binary way of talking and interacting with gender in class and in the classroom, we can only control the four walls we teach in. Keenan verified this thought in their article, There's a Reason the Department of Education is Ignoring Trans Kids, by saying, the Department of Education is teaching children that gender is something that institutions rather than individuals get to define. Here, American schools are simply a reflection of U.S. society. In most of the United States, there are just two options for legal gender, male and female. Beyond gender, ideas about proper sexuality expression are also constructed in schools on a daily basis as well. I can't help but to think about the viral video of a male teacher at school proposing to his girlfriend and fellow teacher at the school, surrounded by their cheering students, or the viral Facebook post of the elementary school teacher who wore her wedding dress to school as a first look photo shoot with her students. Or I think about the fact that when I started my role as a new teacher this year, one of the first questions I was asked by teachers and students upon seeing my engagement ring was about my fiancé and what he was like, despite not knowing anything about me or my sexuality. These experiences directly contradict with an idea that I brought up in my introduction when a teacher or other school adult is confronted with a child expressing identity or sexuality that is not binary or heterosexual. They are too young to understand it. How can they be too young to understand LGBTQIAP+ identities when heterosexual identities are constantly talked about, reflected, and deemed as appropriate throughout their schooling experience? J.B. Mayo Jr. talks about and sums this sentiment up in their introduction to the article, Adults' Complicity in Limiting Students' Understanding of Sex, Gender, and Sexuality at School. They say, in addition, the claim that students in elementary schools are unaware of sex and sexuality and therefore need their innocence protected is completely debunked. Ryan, 77-90, reminds us that not only are heteronormative notions of sexuality already present in the elementary classroom, but they are mainstream and key components of classroom life. Aside from the fact that many schools consistently reinforce heteronormative identities through the situations mentioned earlier, sometimes these constructions and reinforcements can be more insidious, especially in rural schools. Many of the readings discuss the effect of rural and often more conservative environments on LGBTQIAP+ students. Sean McCollum discussed this at length in their article, Country Outposts. They discuss the effects that wider community views and expectations can have on the actual response and viewpoints of the school and administration at the school. They say, many rural residents pride themselves on their conservative social and religious views and distrust those whose identities and lifestyles fall outside those structures. The relatively recent emergence of the national gay rights movement and the fact that gay kids are growing up and coming out in their small towns presents unnerving challenges to many rural residents and their ideas of how the world should work. Many teachers and admin feel almost as if they are at the mercy of the wider community view and expectations, or sometimes even agree with them, about gender and sexuality expression, and therefore may stifle and prevent students' authentic expression of their own identities. McCollum and Chris Mayo both talk about the higher instances of violence that LGBTQIAP+ students face in rural communities. Which leads me to my last point about how schools reinforce the construction of gender and sexuality expression grounded in homophobia and heteronormativity. Schools passively reinforce these expectations through their responses or lack of response to instances of bullying and harassment faced by LGBTQIAP+ students. Oftentimes, schools don't know how to specifically address or discuss these instances of homophobic bullying and end up responding with lackluster responses that subtly reinforce the homophobic behavior. Even worse is when a school fails to respond, leaving both the offender and the victim in a place where they are affirmed as correct or incorrect in their identities and belief. This can prove to be incredibly detrimental to LGBTQIAP+ youth, as they can be driven to acts of self-harm or even suicide in the face of constantly being tortured based on their identity, while simultaneously being told through inaction of the school that they are indeed wrong or not worthy of protection based on who they are. Bonnie Wozalek tells the stories of Lindsay Watson and Aaron Dimlow in their article, The School to Coffin Pipeline, Queer Youth Suicide and Living in the In-Between, and discusses the effects and potential dangers of schools' lackluster response to violence against LGBTQIAP+ students. They say, their stories demonstrates a particular absence of care at school that is sustained by their peers, teachers, and administrators. It is the absence of care often demonstrated by inaction against injustices and the maintenance of school policies that allow the School to Coffin Pipeline to thrive. The next issue that I want to discuss has to do with the way that schools regulate and censor LGBTQIAP+ identities. One of the most egregious examples of this type of activity that stood out to me in the readings was the way that schools have attempted to stifle the existence and activities of GSAs aimed at giving these students a network of support and a place to begin educating the school and creating a safer experience for all students, but most importantly for LGBTQIAP+ students. Chris Mayo discussed this issue at length in their book, LGBTQ Youth in Education, Policies and Practices, discussing court cases that have been adjudicated as recently as the early 2000s, attempting to prevent these types of organizations in school, or even schools trying to ask that these organizations become diversity clubs, thus rendering the identity as a space for LGBTQIA+ individuals invisible. Another way that schools can actively censor and deny students access to information that could provide them with support or even information that could be integral to maintaining their mental and physical health is by schools quite literally censoring and blocking content that the school deems as inappropriate because it is about LGBTQIA+ issues. Roland Ellis discusses their experience in school and the way that schools denied students access to LGBTQIA+ information on the internet in their video Indoctrination, A History of Homophobia in Schools. While Ellis is discussing their experiences in the UK, as an educator in the United States, I know that similar content blockers are indeed enabled in our schools here as well. This denial of access to sites that are deemed inappropriate because they are related to LGBTQIA+ content both reaffirms the idea that their identities are inappropriate, but also denies students access to important information and the potential to connect to communities and support systems that they may not have access to in their hometowns or schools. Chris Mayo talked about the role that online communities and forums played for LGBTQIA+ youth and how these platforms could offer students important access to information and experiences of support that could be life-saving and positive for them. Especially for students in rural communities where they might not have access to this information, these places can prove imperative for youth. Mayo says, Hiller and Harrison 2007 found that lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth were more likely to find the sorts of support AJ found online than in their face-to-face communities. Other researchers have found that accessing health-related information online enables LGB students to more readily access health services in their local communities, bolstered as they are with information ahead of time and a better idea of what to expect. I've talked a lot about what schools have gotten wrong and continue to get wrong, but I think it is important to also talk about the ways that schools can get it right as well. Because I think more than anything, it illustrates powerfully how the school can actively choose to help and reinforce ideas and identities for LGBTQIA+ students. The first point that I would like to make is about the positive impact that well-supported GSAs can have for students. J.B. Mayo Jr. discusses the importance and impact that well-supported GSAs can have for LGBTQIA+ students in their article, Expanding the Meaning of Social Education, What the Social Studies Can Learn from Gay-Straight Alliances. Mayo discusses specifically research conducted at Freedom High School and what their GSA has done, specifically as it's related to a partnership with social studies classrooms, which I love as a social studies teacher. Mayo makes a point that really stood out to me about what the existence of these organizations and the connection with classroom learning can do for LGBTQIA+ students. They say, indeed, the mere presence of a GSA acknowledges a queer existence at school, which sends supportive messages to those students too fearful or simply not ready yet to attend meetings, see Mayo 2009. What is particularly significant about the GSA at Freedom High School, as a result, is that a space was created where its members demonstrated an ethos of acceptance and an understanding of nuanced social education that will benefit social studies classrooms and school communities more generally. Next, schools can begin looking at curriculum as a place to reaffirm and support students' identities by focusing on curriculum that is inclusive and reinstates LGBTQIA+ issues and stories as important and meaningful for education. As a social studies teacher, this is something I am striving to do, and the article by J.B. Mayo Jr., Engaging Two-Spirit Knowledge as a Means to Deconstruct the Gender Binary, showed me a perfect place to start. It is not hard to do this, and it is not something that will require everyone to reinvent the wheel. It is just something, a small action that we can take to affirm and give visibility to LGBTQIA+ identities and stories that have always been there and have always been important. Finally, one incredibly important way teachers and admin can shape a healthy environment for LGBTQIA+ students is by supporting and allowing teachers to authentically express their gender and sexuality beyond a heterosexual binary. The rise of teachers using the gender-neutral honorific mix offers students a few important messages. One, that being LGBTQIAP+ and not identifying as Mr. or Ms. doesn't make you less than. You can be a respected teacher who is successful and supported in their job. For non-LGBTQIAP+ students, it teaches them the same, that it is normal and okay to identify outside the traditional boxes we create. It automatically creates a space where we ensure that individual identities are respected, and that can work wonders. The first couple paragraphs of Ben Keslin's article, Miss, Mr., or Mix, Non-Binary Teachers Embrace Gender-Neutral Honorific, says it all for me. It shows that students are capable of understanding and supporting. They say, when Maddie Lubert, 25, returned after a week away from the classroom, their students were complaining about the substitute teacher. Lubert dismissed the student complaints at first. My students said, the substitute was awful. I was like, yeah, right, everyone says that, Lubert told NBC News. But then the students started explaining why they didn't like the substitute. My student said to me, the substitute was really disrespectful. She wasn't using your pronouns or your name. Teachers and administration do indeed control the way that gender and sexuality are taught and affirmed in school, but they have a choice. Continue to push the outdated binary, heteronormative, and homophobic way of the past, or move forward toward a more inclusive environment that supports, protects, and fosters students of all identities. It starts with us.